Hello and welcome to our May event for our BCS Chester and North Wales branch. Lovely to have you here. We've also got a number of our neighbouring members from BCS Shropshire, so welcome to yourselves as well. So tonight's guest speaker is Dr. Les Pritchard. So Les has been a part of the committee up until recently for many years, so he's very well known to the people in Chester and North Wales BCS branch. He has got a distinguished career working as a chartered IT professional and a doctorate in distributed networks and security. He's been a lead auditor and somebody that I've worked personally close with as well on ISO 27001. And I know that there will be a number of people asking lots and lots of questions. But the format tonight is that feel free to send through your questions and we will see if there is groupings that we can then take at chunks at the end. And I'll facilitate a short Q&A at the end as well. So please do send through your questions and we'll group them all up and fire through them at the end. So without further ado, I shall introduce Les. Welcome back, should I say?
Thank you very much. Yes, it's nice to be back virtually. Sadly, I don't get to see everyone, but
I know
it's nice to be back in some
won't be
form.
long, I'm sure.
Yes, yeah, we'll look forward to next time we all meet up. It's not far away from now. I was just telling everyone there that I've just had the vaccine today, so I apologise if the nanobots that I've been injected with do interfere with the broadcast today, but that's
Hopefully
Bill Gates wants to listen in on that side. So
right, well, we'll get a good talk anyway.
Thank you very much. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's good to speak to you all. Good to see the names there on the attendance list. I hope you find this evening's talk useful. As Martin says, I've worked in what's now cyber security, cyber attacks, the world of this that was when I started IT security, and it's gone through many different guises over the years. But the one thing that has changed is the impact of potential attacks and the awareness of this. Going back a number of years, it would be, I work in IT security, and people would say, oh, is that the antivirus stuff? So it's changed a little bit. At least people are aware of these things now. We work with companies of all sizes, from your very small startups up to nationals, PLCs. We work with a lot of national and international charities. And I see all kinds of different challenges, and we look to find the solutions that meet their requirements. We're always trying to find the right kind of solution for your organization. What I'm going to be talking about today, when the guys asked me to give a talk this evening, I thought I'll talk about an incident that happened, and I will describe some of the steps that we went through. And really, an alternative title for today's presentation could have been 10 lessons to learn from someone else's mistakes, because if we can learn from someone else's mistakes, it's less dramatic, it's less costly, hopefully, and hopefully you can pick up from what they've experienced and some things to take away to then potentially secure your systems, your business. And that's what I want to get out of this today. So I'm going to tell the story, tell some components of what happened, and then throughout it, I'm going to have these points which I'd just like you to consider. If you take those away, investigate those at some point in the future, that will be great, because hopefully it will then increase everybody's awareness on that side of things. Now, if you remember the old Dragnet series from many, many years ago, then I think this is very appropriate. I'm talking about a real case. This is exactly what happened, minus a few little subtle details. But of course, I have changed the names to protect the innocent, or the victims, if you would like to say. So I'll introduce first of all the company which was impacted. We're going to call them Playtronics. They're not the future of toys, they're the generic streaming service who was the victim of this particular attack. So they're a company, Playtronics, who develops and operates a streaming service that registered users consume. So they go in there and consume content from this particular site. It's a subscription-based service, so people pay to be subscribed to this, and therefore it's very desirable. The site is actually run under a brand that is a well-known brand. It has people all over the world aware of this particular brand, and for the purposes of this, we'll call them eCorp. Hopefully, there might be one or two of you who spotted some things in here about names. We've got some references to corny or old hacker movies through this, so a bit of a competition. If you want to guess the names of the movies that I'm screenshotting in here, then please do that. We should have had a prize for this, but we've got a few of them scattered through the presentation. So let's talk about the incident. How did it all start? Well, the first thing that happened was the team at Playtronics were notified of some errors occurring on the site. Now, like any good cyber attack, which they didn't know it was at the time, this occurred on a Saturday afternoon. It's always the weekend. Weekends are an effective time if you are an attacker, because typically teams may not be as full over the weekend. They may not even be on over the weekend. It may just be an alert system. So there are risks associated with that they can really take advantage of. So they were notified by users of the site. They had some cases coming in through the support saying, we're having problems. We're unable to log in to the site. Those who were logged in were starting to see content disappear. They weren't able to access content. If they were consuming some of it, it was continuing. But when they tried to find other content or move to other parts of the site, it was just not accessible. So they were losing this content. Okay, bit of a problem there. This progressed over the course of minutes, half an hour or so, to the point where the site was seemingly becoming unavailable. Anyone who was attempting to move around, move to different sections of the site, or log in were failing. All they could see was the standard login page, which is a largely static page, but they couldn't get any further than that. The initial investigation by the team, they looked at the systems and they were trying to work out what was going wrong. They eventually, by digging through some of the logs, identified some errors coming from the database cluster. Like any web application, there was a series of a front end, back end services, and the database at the back end, which was a full cluster. And this database cluster was throwing up the errors. Everything else appeared functional. So the first thing, as we go through our little lessons and pointers, is a really easy one. At this point, the team, first of all, weren't aware of the issues until their users, the customers, started logging their problems. And when they went to look at it, they weren't really obviously clear what was going wrong. They were having to poke around systems. They were having to look at logs, literally catting logs within their Linux servers to try and work out what was going on. So the first thing that they've learned, and hopefully you can take away from this, is that monitoring your systems is essential for any kind of web application, website, or your internal network. And it's often missed. We set up servers, we have them maybe logging to a log file somewhere, but who's actually monitoring that? Who's understanding what's going on in that system? So the first challenge came out there, that they've not got this logging system, so they're a little bit in the dark. And this is where they're scratching their heads and saying, what's actually happened? They called us. I go to help them out. And the first thing we look at is the database. At this point, we're still not aware of this being a security incident. And the title of the talk, the theme of the talk, you've probably seen where this is going, but at this point, they've contacted us saying, our database cluster has got problems. There's errors coming out. Can you help us fix the cluster? So we take a look at the cluster and discover that it's corrupt. Servers are still running. There's been no hardware failures. There's been no service failures in the individual servers themselves, but they are falling out of the cluster. So if you've not dealt with database clusters, you'll have lots of nodes. They all join in there, and of course you've got a coming and going of them sometimes, and a cluster's very good at dealing with that normally. But the individual nodes were trying to join, rejoin, and were failing. And whilst we managed to get to a couple of servers that still had the database accessible at the very low level, when we actually got into it, we discovered that a lot of the core tables were missing. So we've got a real problem here. Cluster nodes failing. We've got the data seemingly not visible. What's happened here? Is it hidden? Is there something gone on there? Something very strange. We're looking through this to try and work out what's going on. At this point, the client, like any company that you tend to deal with, the first thing they want to do is get things back up and running again, especially when they said, we've just launched a new product and people are coming to the site to consume this. So it's a busy time. We've got lots of people on the site. Our eCorp, our client, is going to get very upset with us if our site's offline. We need to get this priority, get it back up and running. And that's so often the case, understandably, from a business point of view, but it's always the challenge when you're trying to understand what's gone wrong and then try to fix that whilst putting a band-aid over it just to get it up and running again. Never perfect, but that was the pressure that they had. So we said, first steps, to get the site up and accessible, we'll spin up a new server with a database on it. So new database server, just a single one for now, just to limp along, and we'll restore the data to it. And very importantly, whenever you're doing any kind of investigation of an event like this, don't just pile on the servers that have been impacted. You want to preserve them to understand what's gone on. You know, like any good engineers, which I'm sure there are many listening to this now, you want to understand the root cause of any problems. Otherwise, what's to stop it happening again? At this point, we are still thinking it's some kind of cluster config, some error that's been caused on the systems. We're not worried about anything else at this point. We start deploying a new database server, and we talk to the client, and I say, backups, can we get the backup of the database so we can restore that to it? And the client comes along and says, yeah, we've just had a look and we've discovered that the backup script has not run for the last 4 weeks. Just keep that in your mind for a second. 4 weeks, this backup of their core database had not been running. They'd automated it and they'd not been monitoring it. They didn't have any alerts in place. Not good. Right, we've got a problem. So we're running through this and say we can get the backup, your 4-week-old backup restored. How much of an impact is that going to be? How much do you think the data's changed in the last 4 weeks? I know this is horrible territory, but we're just trying to get something up and running at this point. Have you had many people join in the last 4 weeks? And then you go, yeah, we've had a marketing campaign recently, and we've had about 15,000 people sign up. So at this point, we've got a 4-week-old copy of their database, and we have potentially 15,000 users that they have lost. Okay, we've got financial details, we've got other details we could probably extract from. However, most of their core data is potentially lost at this point. Really, really worrying situation to be in at this point. But it does bring us to, and this is, I think, it's number 2, but I think it's probably the most important one. I think everybody should go away and do. It sounds blatantly obvious, but companies still are not checking, validating their backups. I go to lots of companies, lots of organizations who confidently say, yeah, we've got backups running. And when you poke in a little bit, you see that it's automated, but they have no alerts in place. So they won't actually know if that stops. And I've seen that a few times where I've gone to maybe audit a company and I've said, show me your backup logs. And then that's when they suddenly realize it hasn't been running the backups for a week or whatever. And then they need to quickly go and do something about that. Not just making sure the backups run though, it's about validity of those backups. Are you backing up all of the data you need? And is that backup, is it the integrity of the backup there? Can you extract the data? You remember, I'm sure many of you will remember the bad old days of restoring from tape and how precarious that would be, and the amount of restores we've run when the tape 8 failed after several hours, and you just lose all of that archive. So please do validate. Don't just run backups. Have a regular check to make sure that you restore a couple of files, take a look at them, and make sure that they are all accurate. They match. Run a hash on them. You can automate some of this, but you can run a check maybe on a monthly basis just to check this. And sometimes companies will push back and go, oh no, that's restoring from backup takes too long. It's just going to be a hassle. At which point I say, well, are you listening to yourself? It takes too long to restore from backup. If you've lost your core database, how does it takes too long to restore from backup sound to you? I think you need to review what your backup mechanisms are. And we've had systems where people have backed up to the cloud, which is brilliant. Lots of bonuses from doing that. But then they suddenly realize that the time taken to restore the data would take potentially days. And that would just cause too much damage to the business. So you've got to find the right kind of backup solution for your business and for your connectivity, for your requirements. If you can't afford to be off for more than half a day, you need a backup solution to deal with that. If you could blag it for a week whilst that restore's running, that's perfectly fine. That's no problem. But it's all about finding the right solution for you as a business. So please, that's number one. We're seeing ransomware on the increase all of the time. Backups protect you so much against those kind of attacks as well. So that's your first step. Tomorrow morning, please do go and ask those questions or check it yourself. At this point, we've got no backups beyond 4 weeks ago and a lot of data potentially missing. So we had to start the process of extracting the data. We poked around the various cluster nodes and we were able to recover from various servers the binary logs. So in databases, if you've not worked with databases, they all record, they have a binary log, which is recording all of the transactions that have gone on in simple terms, and they've got that in a continuous log. Unfortunately, because the cluster had somehow become corrupted, the logs had also become corrupted. So we had to go through and I had to dissect the binary logs and extract all of the good data, all of the good records, all of the good insertions into the database and compile them together to then restore them to our newly built database. Thankfully, we were able to do that. We got the data onto the new system and it was, I believe, almost everybody. I think we weren't aware, we haven't been told since if anybody was lost, but I don't believe anybody was. I've been assured that everybody was able to access their systems again. So that was a bit of good news that we were able to extract that from the binary logs. It's not a quick process, especially when you had the amount of data they had to go through and pick it all out and to make sure that it's all synchronized. But through that process, we were also able to do a bit of an analysis of what had gone on in that database over the last 24 hours. What had caused this? Were there errors? We couldn't see anything in the logs up until a point where they lost connection. What was happening to cause it to all apparently disappear and the cluster nodes to fall out? Well, we found a number of SQL statements that looked something like this. Dropping all of the tables, the key tables for the users, for the modules, for the core content, they had all been dropped with simple drop commands. Very, very scary. And even more so, we saw further drops of anything that appeared to be visible to this particular user account. And that included the tables that helped synchronize and manage the database cluster. So that's why the cluster had become corrupt, because it had no knowledge of itself. It had no way of synchronizing the nodes. And that's a good point, that often people will focus on one things against, as an engineering people, as computer scientists people, we know to always look that you've got the causation is not necessarily the impact that you're seeing. So you may say, oh, the database cluster's corrupt. That's clearly lost all of the data. No, it was actually this series of very, very nasty commands that had been run against the database server that caused the cluster to fall apart. The cluster falling apart was actually a side effect of a much worse attack on the system. At this point, then, it is clear that, unfortunately, this organization has been hit by somebody doing something they shouldn't. And there's various different angles to this. The first question we ask is, have you had any staff members leave recently under a cloud? Anybody who may have had access to this particular database server? No, there was nobody there. We did a quick sweep. We spoke about all the staff. Nobody was upset. Nobody was potentially a malicious user. So we thought it's sounding pretty confident that that wasn't the case. So who might have done this? We're talking to some of the people about this along the way. And then we talked to the MD, who's clearly very keen to find out more about this. And then we get the, oh yes, yeah, we forgot to mention about this. What's happened is the site, being a service that delivers content, so this streaming content that is paid for, we've had a problem with criminals. They would register on our site, and then they would extract the URL for the streaming material whilst they were accessing it, and then sell it off as part of a package. So I'm sure you may well have heard of these streaming boxes and streaming services that go out and try and steal various, Sky TV and cable TV in the US, and they'll put it together in a package that they resell. Very similar to that, they were selling this as part of a package of this particular area of streaming material. So they were making good money out of this. The company were aware of this and made a decision to implement DRM. They'd had some controls in place that clearly weren't working, so they implemented a far more powerful DRM that prevented the sharing of those URLs. And it shut down that straight away. And they were really pleased with that, apparently. Unfortunately, this had clearly led to the bad guys, who were making a good bit of money out of this, very upset. And that leads us to your awareness of, when you're a company with an online presence, you're selling a service, just like a physical service. When you're running a shop or you've got a hotel or whatever it may be, you need to understand the potential threats. Of course, we deal with environmental threats in physical locations, but you also need to understand what other potential threats there are. It's not about scaring people. It's not about trying to over-egg what the risks are. It's about understanding and then putting reasonable precautions in place. You go into a post office or a bank, there are security measures in place. If I went to my local coffee shop and they had those huge guards, well, actually this example probably doesn't work now because they probably have got the large perspex screens in the way at the moment, but they haven't got the same security measures in place that you would have in a bank, because they've implemented the right kind of controls for their particular business. You go to a newsagent, so all of the alcohol is out of the way, it's not by the door, so someone can grab them. So it's about understanding those. And in this case, the company did have some awareness of it, but they didn't really appreciate what that meant. Furthering this conversation with the MD, he said, "Oh yeah, there were some quite angry discussions about this on some forum they were aware of, where these people were stealing streams and reselling them." So at that point, we think, well, we've got a pretty likely reason here, and that helps. If you can understand their motivation, then you can understand a little bit more about potentially what they're trying to do with the site or whatever they're trying to attack. So we need to work out how the attackers actually got into the system. How did they gain access to the core? They've got a front end, they've got a back end layer, and then they've got the database servers. How did they get all the way back, or the ability to run SQL commands directly onto the database? How was that even possible? So whilst we're looking at the issues and trying to track down that, we noticed some other things going on the site that had been quickly relaunched. We've got it up and running, but we're seeing a large amount of traffic coming in from a few IPs, a handful of IP addresses, and the dev team at Playtronics was looking at this going, okay, there's something going on, let's look at the logs. They don't have brilliant monitoring, so they were having to look at the raw logs. And they discovered that the traffic was due to attempted logins. And what they were doing is they were attempting to brute force guess the passwords in the account. At this point, it actually suggests that there were two prongs of attack here. One was still attempting to gain access to the system to resell, whilst another, I'm guessing another individual or another organization, were simply seeking to get revenge and cause this kind of disruption to the company. So we've got two angles here that are going on. The database has been secured. I'll return to that in a moment, but we will cover some interesting elements there. But we need to work out what this network traffic is on this side of things. But most of the traffic was purely people brute forcing the logins, and it leads to this very important lesson, which is if you are building a system, if you are maintaining a system, if you've got an Active Directory on your network, any kind of login system that you have control over, apply limits. So I have limits on the amount of login attempts someone can make against an account. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you completely lock out that account until they get it manually unlocked. It can just be that you add a delay. So after 5 login attempts, you add a 10-minute delay until they can attempt to log in again. And we're quite familiar with this. You may well have seen this when you try to log into sites. If you've forgotten a password, you get that message saying, please come back later and try again. That's perfectly feasible to do. That is a brilliant defense against brute forcing. 5 password guesses is not going to get you very far. But also, it's been since day 0 of computing, people have talked about enforcing good password hygiene, having good quality passwords where possible when you're building a system. Again, with your Active Directory or any other kind of systems you're using, G Suite, Office 365, enforce password quality, minimum length, minimum quality. If you can do that, it just means that you haven't got the people who, and in this case, they admitted it, they found that there were people with really obvious passwords. We're talking, there was one when we did a scan later on who had a password of the name of the company. Not the smartest password going. So please do enforce some kind of restrictions on this kind of thing, because that would just block these kind of brute force attempts. And that's what a huge amount of password attacks are about. It's about purely brute force and the poor ability for most people to come up with novel or strong passwords. So the team we were supporting said, okay, there's about 5 IP addresses that are hitting us at this point. What we'll do is we'll block those IP addresses at the firewall. So we will stop those, and then that will be the end of it, hopefully. They blocked those IP addresses. At the same time, they then wrote a bit of code. They quickly patched the login process that would block anybody who had a failed number of login attempts. I think that was 10, to block that IP address for 24 hours from accessing the site. They thought, that's great, we'll just do that, then they won't be able to carry on this particular attack. That was great for about 20 minutes. And then all hell broke loose. The site started getting hit from all over the world. IP addresses all over the world. As soon as they got blocked, they just dropped off and a new IP address appeared instead of it. And we were looking at some of the IP addresses. We were tracing these back to VMs from Oracle Cloud. There was companies. There was a very large investment company in London we were getting pings from, all clearly compromised systems. So these attackers were very resourceful, and they had known quite quickly this had happened, that they'd been blocked. So they had just made use of maybe what you might have called a botnet. That was the phrase that we would use years ago, that we talk about the idea of lots and lots of systems all over the world that have been accessed. Somebody's got control of them. It could even be the Wi-Fi routers, your broadband routers, that has a vulnerability in it, and they will just have a whole flood of these that they can call on at a moment's notice and say, please run this code, start brute forcing that particular site, and have fun. So at that point, we say, look, guys, this is priority now. We need to stop this because this is impacting the people who are still wanting to use your site. So we implemented very quickly a web application firewall using a service. We used Cloudflare, and that's a great tip. If you have a website, if you have a web application, and you're not using a web application firewall, I would strongly advise you to go and have a look at them and see what they can offer. The way a WAF, as we colloquially know them, is that they work by being a proxy in the middle of the traffic between the clients visiting your site and your servers. And they analyze all traffic coming in. So as the traffic's heading towards your site, people like Cloudflare, there's a lot of others out there, they will look at that traffic and go, that looks suspicious, or your IP looks suspicious, or we've seen this kind of attempt at an attack before. And it will slow down or even block the IP addresses, or it will stop the data, the traffic getting to your servers. So it's a really powerful way of being able to block we call the cheap attacks, people who just want to try and DDoS your site, denial of service of your site, or just try and attack it with some what they call kiddie scripting type attackers. So can we use those? Yeah, well, if we stick a web application firewall in between, that will take out a lot of that. We did in this case, and it stopped those attacks. So it stopped those very, very quickly. Thankfully, services like Cloudflare are very, very quick to deploy. It really didn't take as long to put that in place, and it stopped that. We can take a breath. The site is running, albeit on just a single database server. It's just temporary, but at the moment, things are behaving. Only genuine users are on the site. So at this point, we can step back a bit, and we have to ask that question of what data had actually been taken. Was there personal data that had been taken? Has someone stolen that data? If it is personal data, then that very awkward question comes about of, if that's come about, you've got to notify the ICO, there's been a data breach. But first of all, we needed to establish, had anything actually been taken? And that's where we talked about monitoring, but we need logging. If you've got logging on your essential systems, so if you've got a database, you can enable logging. You can enable logging to record the queries that have been made. You've got to be mindful that logs can grow and become absolutely huge. So there's challenges there with that. So you have to be careful about what you're actually doing. But you need to be aware of this. You have to have logs in place to actually track. Whilst they didn't have a lot of logging in place, thankfully, there was enough logs there between that, combining that with the binary logs, with the network traffic logs as well, to establish, to thankfully confirm the timeline, everything that happened. None of the data was actually exfiltrated. It was purely the database level was a pure act of vandalism. So this again confirms this idea that there was one group of people trying to get access again to this site to resell the streams, and the other side was just really, really upset and wanted to damage and take them offline. So they hadn't extracted anything. We were confident with that, go through everything that we were able to put together. But having that kind of logging in place, some kind of records, because if you do need to, if you have got any concern over that, you need to speak to the ICO, you need to report it, and then you need to be able to demonstrate what's happened and what data may have been affected from that. But a sideline from this, which was quite interesting, which I've thrown in as another pointer, thankfully it wasn't the case in this scenario because there wasn't anything to report. But as we were looking into this and confirming the evidence, we witnessed the conversation between Playtronics and eCorp over what should happen if the data had been potentially exposed, extracted from the database. The Playtronics company was saying, well, I suppose you will have to report it to the ICO, or we'll report it to the ICO. And eCorp was saying, hang on, no, we are the data controllers, you're just the data processors. So we will make the decision over whether we're going to report it or not. And they were having their legal team were coming up with various reasons and justifications for doing it this way or that. But it did raise an interesting point that we did thankfully dodge in this case. But it is, if you are dealing with third party, if you're providing a service, if you're providing an application, a site, something that deals with personal data, our data protection consultants said what you need to do is you need to have clearly defined in the agreements, so in your contracts, in your agreements, data ownership, who's a data controller, who's a data processor, and who has the reporting responsibilities. Now, whether that tallies with legal, there's a whole, that's for lawyers to talk about on another day. But in terms of your protection, if you are a supplier of this stuff, you need to have that nailed down, and then at least you can point back to it and say, no, we agreed. I know that you're worried now about your business, but back then when you were happy about things, you agreed that of course we're going to abide by the rules and that we will report it in the correct way. So it's about having that nailed down there so that you can fall back on that. You can protect yourselves if you did feel that you were capable, appropriate to report that. Then that's something that's just to consider now, because in the heat of the moment, you don't want to really be having those conversations. Certainly not. So thankfully, lawyers averted, and no offense if anybody's a lawyer on this, but we just didn't want any of that to complicate things even more. So we could return to the techie stuff. We could get back to the geek, and we said we've got to run some vulnerability assessments because we're still not clear. We blocked further attacks, but we're still not clear about how they got in the first place. So whilst we have blocked one attempt, we need to be able to make sure that however the person got in to actually delete the data from the database in the first place, it isn't just going to return tomorrow and do exactly the same thing. So we ran vulnerability assessment, we did a security assessment of both the infrastructure and the source code itself. We ran both of those, and unfortunately, we found a number of vulnerabilities. And we found some with some libraries that were being used on the site that did allow for SQL injection style attacks to occur. So at this point, we're looking at it and think this is the highly likely avenue that they've used. They're clearly capable people who've gone through this, and it's there screaming right in front of us for this side of things. We're not just assuming that that's the case. We're not going to go, yeah, that's fine, it's the only one, but certainly we need to be able to plug this gap. We need to patch this code and import the right dependencies. And this is one that happens over and over again. People will build sites and it's all nice and functional, but dependencies, not just even your code. The classic one, when I speak to some developers and I talk about security, vulnerability testing, pen testing, all of this side of things, and some developers have said to me in the past, it's okay, I write everything securely, so it's fine. I make sure it's all secure. Yeah, I can hear the laughter from here from some of you. At this point, I know we're going to have fun with this particular person, but it's not about that. It's not, and the way I win them around is, well, okay, your code might be perfect. It might be the best ever. I believe you. But how about all those dependencies? How about all those libraries that you're importing? And what about the libraries, the dependencies that those are then pulling in? And if you look at the stats in various different languages, when you import a library, there's invariably several layers of imports that they're doing to other libraries. And there's a whole web of dependencies going on there. And it's just not practical for you to keep above all of that, to know that version 1.83 has now become vulnerable and there needs an upgrade of this, that, and the other. So what you need to do is make sure that you are testing your code on a regular basis and your infrastructure. So that's another key essential thing to do. And it's not just if you're having pen tests, if you want to go through a penetration test where someone is manually attempting to break into your site or to find weaknesses, that's brilliant. That is really, really worthwhile doing. But normally people do that once a year at most, because it's just not worth it to do it more than that, they think. Unfortunately, a year's a long time in technology. So in between, you need to be running infrastructure scans, you need to be testing your servers for vulnerability issues, and importantly, you need to be scanning your code. There's a whole bunch of static code analysis tools that will scan your code and its dependencies for security weaknesses. GitHub have one built in now. My personal favorite is one called SNYK, SNYK, which is a great little service. It's free at the base level. So if you are a small developer and you want to have a play with it, it's brilliant. You just plug it into your repo and it will just scan your code. And it comes up with potential vulnerabilities in your code, but I know everybody listening here never does anything wrong. So it will be more about your dependencies, and it will come up and it will say, hey, this dependency that you're importing here has got an issue. There's a new version of that. And depending on the language, some of them will then give you a pull request to then import the latest versions of the libraries. Of course, don't just do that blindly, because you may end up with some other issues in terms of compatibility, but it's at least flagging up for you to say, hey, there's a problem here, we need to address this. And in this particular scenario, if Playtronics would have been aware of that, they could have blocked this all. The people wishing to attack the site must have run a quick assessment and thought it was their birthday, because they were screaming. They didn't even have to do anything unusual. There were vulnerabilities there in the dependencies that they were able to manipulate and send that nasty set of drop commands to the database. So we need to be aware of that. Please do it. Go out, have a look at GitHub, Snyk, they're great tools. There's a few others out there and some language specific ones that you can run against your code. It just identifies during development rather than once you've uploaded it. Vulnerability scanning, vulnerability testing, it's fairly straightforward to organize, and that's a really worthwhile thing to do if you're running any kind of web presence, as in a web application or something that could be the target. An easy win for us all the time when we're doing security assessments, companies ask us to look at it, is people say, oh, and we've got WordPress site. Okay, WordPress site, that will highlight some vulnerabilities for us straight away, because so many people will get a WordPress site, fantastic system, brilliant, but it's very complicated, and invariably what happens is the site gets built and it gets left. Maybe the developers will simply be paid to develop it, and they will leave the site in its old version of WordPress. So when you look at these sites, so often they've got vulnerable plugins, they've just got vulnerable editions of WordPress. We've got one client who has probably about 10 separate WordPress sites. Every time we scan them, there's something going on there, and we're working with them to say, come on, we need to be a bit more proactive about this. You need to get your providers to be far more proactive in terms of installing security updates and so on. But monitoring, if you can monitor, you can hopefully spot things before the bad guys can spot it. So then we came to the database. We're saying, what's going on here? How on earth were they able to, we understand that they were able to use this vulnerable library, but how did that translate to them being able to run drop commands on the database? So we take a look at the logs. We're looking through what user had run these, and then we have a look at the code. And we discover, probably some of you can see where we're going here, that they were using the one SQL user to run all of their SQL commands. And when I say all of them, the account was actually named after the senior developer, and it was his that he used to do all the data administration on the site, the management of the database server, everything. That had ended up in the code, maybe because it was plonked in there from development at the beginning. Maybe they thought, well, we'll pop that in there for now, and then those golden words of we'll change that later, we'll fix that later. And we then end up with a problem that everybody who is accessing the website, all of the actions invoked by them logging in, viewing the content, changing their details, are all being executed under what is essentially the administrator account for the database. So when these people found the vulnerability and were able to send SQL directly to the database, it was run as the administrator. There was no restrictions there at all. So SQL Server very happily, very kindly said, you're asking me to drop these tables. No problem. I'll do it straight away for you, sir. As it should do, because it was an administrator account. So it's an age-old problem. We used to see this a lot with PHP sites when you'd have a LAMP stack and you'd have PHP talking to MySQL at the back end, and they were invariably, so many of them would have some kind of SQL injection vulnerability. And that's where, for those of you who haven't heard of that term, it's where that you may have some kind of user input into the site, maybe a search or a login page, something where you can type in some input. Normally, the older sites, what they would do is simply take what you've typed in and insert it in the middle of an SQL statement that they'd written in their code and execute that. So if you're able to manipulate that and send it something that changes the action of that particular statement, then you can do anything you want. You can delete data, you can add data, you can drop everything, as happened in this vandalizing state. We realized at this point, we've been very lucky in some respects that this company has been hit by someone who's just out and out vandalized it, dropping all of the tables, rather than them saying, oh, we'll manipulate data, we'll mess up the data some ways. So thankfully, that was the one favor they did for them. So if you are building any kind of web application, any kind of software, or you were just simply using SQL or whatever other type of database servers within your organization, make sure that you control access. Database servers allow you such a granular level of access control. If you've got a search in your website and it's just a read-only, then run those actions through a user account that only has read-only access to the database. Just restrict it as much as you can. It allows far more logging as well, but it can help protect against so many of these attacks. In this case, if it would have been, even if it had just been to the level of saying most actions are being run, they cannot do a drop, obvious one there, because why would a user want to be doing drop? Maybe we're not going to allow them to delete anything. Or if they do delete anything, we make a backup of that particular record just in case. But have a look at your database servers. It happens so many times. Oh, we've got this user, it works. Oh, do you know what? Well, we're developing, it's just going to be easier to use full admin. We'll fix it in production. Don't worry, before it goes to production, it'll be fine, it'll be fine. I'm just going on holiday for a week, so I don't release anything. Don't release it. Yeah, you can see what happens. And then things just get stuck in there. So finally, we're sitting back and thinking we've identified things, we've locked down the database server, we've made some changes there on the user accounts, so many different levels of restrictions now. Has everything finally gone quiet? It did, and then traffic ramped up again massively. We started getting all of those IPs coming in. This one was very simple. They had some systems, in fact, the systems running part of the backend API were exposed. They were not protected by Cloudflare, they were directly accessible, and these attackers had been snooping around and they had discovered these, and they were then, it was a great favor for them. They were then brute forcing the logins again, but this time they could do it direct to the API server, so they could do a far higher frequency of attacks, and the developers had actually put their mitigations in at the front end, so this wasn't affected at all. So we quickly took the API servers just off public accessible IP addresses because everything else was talking through a private IP address. But that was just a good example of what's happened in recent years. Going back 10, 15 years ago and beyond there, if you wanted a server, if you were a developer and you wanted a server, you will have maybe spoken to the person who does that, a system administrator, someone like that. They would maybe grunt at you and then say, oh, we'll order another server. Yeah, we'll get that in. We'll get it in 2 weeks. We'll get that installed. I worked in system administration, so I can talk about both sides of this. But they would do their due diligence. They would harden the server, hopefully, set it all up, and then deploy it to you and have a clear record of that. In the case of the wonderful world of cloud computing, it's brilliant. It gives us so much more flexibility, but on the downside, it has given us so much more flexibility. So developers or team members are free now to spin up new VMs, and what happens is we lose control. We end up with this mess of where are the servers, what servers are running, which ones are critical. The amount of times we spoke to people, what's that server doing? We can't remember. So why is it still running? Well, we don't want to switch it off just in case it breaks things. And it's an old joke, but it still happens. You still see this. Someone left the business, so we don't quite know what he did with that system. So we'll just leave it running. It's only X amount a month, so it's not going to cost that much. We'll just leave it there to be safe. But who's maintaining that server? Who's patching it? Know your structure of the network internally, externally, understand what's exposed to the internet, and then manage it accordingly. You need to have a record of it. If you are the owner of the cloud account, AWS, Azure, or whatever, or you have the privileged access to that, monitor it on a regular basis, check and ask people, why is this server here? What's it doing? Does it really need a public IP address? Most scenarios now, you could probably get away with only the front end server being exposed to the internet, and then everything else is sat behind that on a private VLAN, VPC, whatever you want to call it, a private network that isn't accessible from the outside world. And if you review that, if you maintain, monitor your systems, you can see when things are going to become out of date. You're going to see when the operating system drops out of support, and then do something about it, rather than, unfortunately, finding the problems when they're too late and somebody, like this case, has taken advantage of them. It was a fraught few days and extended a little bit through various bits and pieces. Thankfully, the company's recovered. They're okay. They've certainly learned a lot of lessons from that. The developers have, management have, in terms of time, in terms of investment, in resources. They've made a lot of steps to improve things. You know, it's always the case that the people who've been victims are always the best people to talk to about adding security measures, because they suddenly see the value of it. But I hope that going through these items have, if nothing else, it's been a little interesting story for you to hear, but it may have prompted you to ask some questions, to go back, and even if you're a one-person company, just go back and look at some of these and think, backups, I mentioned that one, that applies to everyone. Really, where is your backup? Can you get it back? Go and restore it tonight. See if you can get it. Not all of it, but just, you know, some of it. Have a think about that. But it was an interesting, challenging event to be able to you know, kind of get through and to be able to understand this. And from that, they've certainly learned a lot. And say, if you can take some of these on, then you can hopefully avoid being in this situation. Don't anger criminal groups who are profiting off your service, I suppose, is one easy thing to do. But yeah, that's what I wanted to cover today. So if there's any questions that are arising from that, yeah.
Les, firstly, thank you very much. I think everybody has taken something from it in terms of I know, even being in the industry a long time, that we still need to continue to hammer home on the basics.
Yes.
And I know an awful lot of it comes down to getting the basics right and not making yourself an easy target.
Yeah.
And I suppose
Absolutely.
one of some of the questions that I think are some of the themes that are coming across from the questions, and also something that I wanted to ask, in terms of that real heat of the moment incident breakout, it's happened. How do you maintain sort of, I suppose, not just making sure that there's logs to look through? As I suppose back in the day, it used to be a case of let's restart everything as quick as possible to try and get everything back up. What are those top tips for you're under the cosh, maybe a small team or an individual? What are those sort of key bits that you don't do?
Yeah, so the first thing you mentioned, that, you know, having a log of what you're doing, I think is really important. Just taking that time, it's a challenge, because people are going, oh, we need to jump in and fix this straight away. But having some kind of record of what you're doing, because that, you know, that could, worst case scenario, lead to you having to defend yourself, your actions. But it's also a good learning opportunity from that side of things. In terms of, you know, what you shouldn't do, as I kind of alluded to with the database cluster, don't try and just flatten everything and restart it or reinstall it on the same system. If you have the capacity, if you're using things like cloud servers, just take that hit and spin up some more for that brief period. Even if you take a snapshot or freeze those particular servers that have been impacted for further investigation, pausing them is quite a good way of doing that, because at least you know then nobody's going to make more attempts to attack it or damage it any further. But being able to pause that and then to try and create something new, and not rushing it's always difficult, but not rushing to just kind of put that band-aid over it and think, oh, that's a quick fix, it's working again now, it all looks good.
No, that's a completely valid points, definitely. I think, obviously, having been in the heat of battle of a few of them, it's sometimes difficult to get perspective. And having somebody being able to just, even if it is somebody that maybe isn't part of the technical team, but at least you can shout a timestamp and a brief, this is what I'm doing, so that it can be recorded. It's massively helpful, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So the push, you took 27001 earlier, and most kind of best practice guides is to have someone who is an incident manager, and that should always really be someone that's not in the technical team, someone who hasn't got that immediate vested interest. So as you say quite rightly, it's someone who's a bit just thinking about, just tell me what you're doing, I'm just logging this, and then if you are capturing evidence, they're responsible for preserving that in some way. So yeah, having someone there that can, they don't need to be technical at all, it's better if they're not, so that they can just record what you're doing, and then doing the necessary coordinating, quite honestly, fielding those calls from the CEO or MD or whatever who's yelling, why is the site off or the system down or whatever. Someone who's that bit of a buffer, so that you're not getting it in the ear whilst we've all been there. You've got your mobile on one hand, and you're typing one-handed on the server on the other hand, and that's not going to be that's a huge risk, isn't it? That's not going to be.
It's not conducive to clear thinking, is it?
No. People just panic on that side.
So we've got a multitude of questions coming through now, so I'll try and whip through a few. But I suppose in a world where PI loss is fairly daily occurrence, how do you know it's your service that has caused the PI loss, and therefore do you then, I suppose it brings up that question of, do you declare to ICO if you believe you may have, or it's that sort of ethical question, really?
Yeah, it's a challenging one. I think you've got to look at the evidence, and that's where it goes back to your last question, really, isn't it? About understanding, capturing that evidence. You've got to. You don't want to be one way or the other. You don't want to be running to the ICO every time you think something's happened with a panic, because you're going to get on their radar then, aren't you? If something like that happens. But you've got to try, and this is where logging comes in, having some kind of records, having some kind of record of the network traffic that's been going through, to then satisfy yourself something's happened. Sometimes if you've got data in there, so say if there's been a database breach, or something's been published online, a whole bunch of user accounts or whatever, something we do regularly as well is we put in, like great map makers and things, we put in fake details. So we'll put into our database fake individuals, users, administrators, and then if anything was ever dumped, then we can categorically say, well, yes, that's clearly come from us, because that was a made-up person in that database. We do the same with things like LinkedIn. For companies, you may make fake profiles for key targets within the business as well, just to see what happens there. So it's a good canary for that side of things.
That's it, a bit of a LinkedIn honeypot.
Yes, yeah, exactly, yes. But yeah, things like that are a way of doing that, and logging can help reassure you one way or the other. Okay.
And in terms of monitoring tools, have you got any, I suppose, personal recommendations, both on the infrastructure and the dev side of things?
Yeah, so there's a few out there. Do you know the one I often come back to is the Elastic Stack? Is one that comes back over and over again, because it's just a very, very flexible system. You can customize it. You've got the raw data going in there, and I work with a number of clients who you go to their offices and they will have a remain nameless, maybe £20,000 a year SIEM solution on one screen. And then everybody's actually looking in the other direction at their Elastic Stack dashboard. They say, oh, that's where we get the data from. This other thing's just showing us pie charts or whatever, So that one's a popular one. I think that's great because it can consume pretty much everything, and you can do what you want with it on that side. You can push development data into that as well. there's other monitoring systems online that you can use, for, and it tends to come down to different languages. So you have different ones for different languages. There's just working with a company recently, you've been using Microsoft the Sentinel package, the service in cloud for a lot of their Microsoft environment and Azure environment, and they're finding that a very, very good service if you're working in that world, in that particular bubble. Like a lot of Microsoft
definitely.
products, they work well together.
They do. They're not cheap either. From a
No,
Sentinel
unfortunately.
perspective.
That's the great thing about Elastic Stack, is it is the
Exactly.
the low cost solution, which anybody can start up, and you can run your own. Even Elastic themselves, they allow you, because you can run ones with AWS and so on, but Elastic actually provide you with a managed solution, so you can go and they will spin it up in AWS for you, but they manage all of the upgrades, which is great because it is a bit of a pain to upgrade all of the elements of it. So for a little bit every month, you can have a nice little Elastic Stack monitoring all your data and complete searchability of it all.
And as with all these things, it tends to be in the configuration and the setup that you get the most value.
It is, yes, yeah. If you've just got it alerting for everything, I'm sure many companies, you may well have seen when people enable DLP, the data loss protection on email, and then you suddenly get bombarded with the default settings are telling you everybody's leaking everything across the network, and that kind of thing. We had a client whose their product IDs were 16-digit numbers that looked like credit card details. So they enabled that, and they had a huge amount of alerts coming up. And the danger is people just ignore them. They just
log fatigue.
Yeah, that's it, exactly.
So here's an interesting one, actually. So do you think that any of the sort of the modern dev techniques, so things like I suppose entity framework, are causing higher levels of vulnerabilities, or maybe developers not taking ownership over maybe parameterizing things or looking after it? I know certainly entity framework seems to be quite noisy, and it's not particularly restrictive. So do you believe they are causing some of these bigger vulnerabilities?
Yes, it's a good opportunity to all wave old man fists at these young
Absolutely.
upstarts. Yeah. There are some benefits of using these kind of frameworks, is that they do things automatically, whereas I mentioned the old days of people building everything from scratch and they'd miss some of the core things. So they do bring some benefits. Some of the things like password management and avoiding things like SQL injection, they do bring a lot of that with it. But I agree that you've got to understand it's the age-old thing. You have to understand underneath what's happening, and if you just got they can largely be looked at like a wizard, aren't they? That you could just say, oh, I just plumb in this bit and it will do the rest. And you really have to understand what's going on. Clearly, you've got to keep that framework up to date. Don't just build it. And that's one problem that's happened a lot recently with the JavaScript frameworks, that they felt like it was a new version coming out every week, and companies would build it in one version and then there'd be a major change and say, well, we'll just leave it in this version for now. And then for now becomes for several years and that side. So yeah, I'm a big fan. You've got to understand what's going on, and if you use it for some of the boilerplate code, some of the basics, but making sure that some of the more in-depth or cleverer stuff is you're in. If you can take control of that, some frameworks will let you do that. If not, then what you want to look then is dividing up those services. They're having I hate to use the buzzword, the microservices style, but having that level of saying, well, this is our core stuff that we really need to know about and do ourselves, and that will be just an API to do X, Y, Z, and then we can use the framework to do all of the nice fluffy stuff on the other side, which won't cause any security issues. So dividing the responsibilities is a way to go, rather than just having it all in this one monolithic framework.
That's it. It's back to the good old solid, dry, all of the sorts of things that people should be doing when it comes to software architecture,
Yeah.
which are very easy to say, but in practice, when the pressure's on and business deadlines need meeting, it's not always easy to be able to put the best practices in place.
Absolutely, that's the wonderful thing about these frameworks, isn't it? You can spin up something really quite quickly, and
Yeah,
that makes people happy. And if you're saying, oh well, we can't do it this way, but the competitors are,
yeah,
that's a difficult argument, isn't it? But yeah, if you can just at least, it's a bit like segregation of duties and your user accounts, do
yeah,
that with key systems, and hopefully that shouldn't take too long to build those compared to you trying to do everything in it.
absolutely. So have you got any, I suppose, following on for a similar theme on the monitoring, have you got any vulnerability testing software that you would recommend, some open source, Greenbone, those sorts of things?
Yeah, there's so Greenbone is one that's they've been going through some interesting changes over recent years, and licensing issues. So the days of being able to easily install that on a server seem a long way ago now,
Yeah,
unfortunately. You can download their VM and you can get that running, and they've got their community driven data feeds. So yeah, that's better than nothing. It is actually pretty good. So that one's good for vulnerability scanning of your systems. You can run that on your internal network as well to understand what's going on there. And then for your websites, web applications, a really good one is the it goes by two names. So the Z attack proxy, OWASP Zap. So if you Google either OWASP, the body that provides loads. The first thing to do is look at the OWASP top 10.
yeah,
That's the guidance on the top 10 categories of vulnerabilities. And then OWASP Zap is a free tool that you can download, and you point it at your website and it trawls through and it just looks at everything, and it will identify your, like vulnerable libraries or potential injection attacks and things in there. It's not 100, none of these are 100%. Either way, they do produce some false positives and miss some things, but they're two good ones to start with. I think that are free and fairly. Certainly, OWASP Zap is just a desktop app, so you can just download that and really poke into your site and what it's doing.
and there's an awful lot of these tools, Les, which I know you talk about DevOps and those sorts of things as well. But with the rise of DevOps and pipelines, most of these tools, if not all of them, can be integrated in some way, shape, or form into those DevOps pipelines as well, can't they?
They can, yes, yeah. So you can have those. So the ideal scenario is that as part of your DevOps pipeline, you're creating those containers, whatever it may be, in your infrastructure, and scanning them at that point. And at least before it gets into production, you've at least given it a cursory scan. You've done a good, reasonable efforts to do that side of things. There are also, there's a number of services out there, commercial services that will run testing, of your web apps, of your scans. So alongside like penetration tests, but they will just do regular scans of your sites. So that that's options for running those kind of tools as well. But yeah, things like SNCC is very good. I mentioned that earlier. That's a good one that will scan both code and containers if you're in the Docker world, and that's a really good one for identifying these kind of things, because their database is pretty mature, in terms of their vulnerabilities that they know about.
So just one last question. So we've had a question come through about whether, like annual audits, so where you have to have a 12-month audit from a certified accountant, etc. Do you think that there's a market for making security and cybersecurity, like the cyber essentials type things, compulsory?
Yeah, I think that there is, because as you say, you've got accountants, you've got all of these other industries where people have to go through this. That was the original push, wasn't it, with the cyber essentials? They were talking about the Welsh government made good steps for requiring that for tenders, and I know of a Scottish bank that required it for business loans. So I think that would be makes sense. I think from the ICO's point of view, it would probably be a good way to go. If you're registered with us and you're handling personal data, then you have to go through some form of cyber essentials. Just to quickly explain, for those of you if you've not encountered it, there's two levels. There's the cyber essentials, which is largely a sort of self-certification, but you answer and provide evidence, and then somebody reviews that. And then you've got the plus, which is more advanced, where they come in or remotely scan your network and make sure that you're running up-to-date software, you've got malware protection, you've got the right controls in place. So I think, yeah, I'm surprised it's taken this long, but it should be something that is pushed, just to, I've always said computer security is like health and safety, and how it was, when it first came in, people were, oh, we're going to do health and safety, I know how to walk up a ladder, and then now I think we all just go, yeah, okay, well, that's health and safety, thanks for keeping us safe, and we understand we have to do this. So it's got to be the next stage, and I'm surprised it's taken this long, really.
Agreed. I'm afraid as we've run over a little bit already, we're going to have to call it a day in terms of the questions, but maybe if we can, I'll pull them together, Les, and bob them through on an email, and we can always send them out. But look,
happy to do that.
A massive thank you. We've had lots of questions in, great conversation, and thank you very much for your time. I'm sure we all appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been great to speak to you, and thanks for all your questions. It's always good to know people are interacting there and listening. So thank you very much, and I hope that
lots of people
will help you for that. So thank you.
And just to say as well, we just had a final question in about whether the session's been recorded, and yes, it has been, and we'll obviously the BCS will top and tail it, and then they'll upload it to the YouTube account. So keep your eye on the YouTube BCS Chester and North Wales branch, and it will be available there shortly. Les, thank you very much, and I hope you all join us again next time.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Cheers.